I'm joined now by Walter Russell Mead. Walter's brand new book came out 4 days before the massacre of October 7th. That it was vitally important, but it did not get the attention it deserved. The Ark of a Covenant is still very much worth your time reading, and I tracked down Walter because I'm concerned about the state of the American-Israel covenant right now. Good morning, Walter. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm well, Hugh. It's great to see you.
So I'm going to start with the major question. How do you assess the state of the American-Israeli connection today?
Well, the first thing I'd say is it's tighter than ever in the sense that whether people love Israel or hate Israel, it occupies a huge part of our national consciousness. I said in the book that Israel occupies a speck on the map of the world, but a continent in the American mind. That is absolutely as true today as ever.
Now, have we lost, however? The reason this interview came about is I wrote our mutual friend, John Podhoretz, and I said, John, who is the expert on American Zionism? Because I am afraid it is not rising to the moment. He said, well, Walter Russell Mead is, because I'm looking for a non-Jew to talk about American Zionism. He said, I don't see it. I don't see the pushback against the anti-Israel rhetoric every day, Walter. Do you?
Well, I think we're seeing a real surge of anti Israel feeling and sadly also anti Jewish, anti Semitic feeling. It's a horrifying reality. I don't think yet it has really changed the sort of the fact that for most Americans they wish Israel well, and many of the people who are protesting these days, or at least some of the protesters, are protesting because they not because they hate Israel, but because they disagree with something that Bibi Netanyahu is doing. Still, what we are seeing, Hugh, is a horrifying surge of the most depraved kind of hate, something that would be fatal to the spirit of the United States if we don't somehow wrestle with this and move to a better place.
Former President Trump is coming up next hour. We're going to talk a lot about Israel because I think it's one of the key divides between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And I'm pretty confident in saying that if Kamala Harris is elected, she will be the least supportive president of Israel in its 76-year history, and that includes Ike Suez. Am I overstating it? Based on the evidence that we have, most recently skipping the prime minister's address to Congress.
That was an ugly and misguided thing to do. Um, you don't have to agree with somebody to do your job, and the job of the vice president, and the vice president doesn't actually have that many jobs, is to preside over the Senate. She should have been there. Yes, it does show a negative disposition. We can hope she's pandering, but I'm afraid there is actually something there.
Yeah, until I moved back to D.C., I lived in California for 25 years. And San Francisco is not Southern California. It is a left wing place. It is a radically anti Israel place. And it rubs off. You just can't grow up in San Francisco politics and be pro Israel, Walter. And you probably know that. I don't know how often you get invited to UC Berkeley. When was the last time that happened?
Hmm. That was some years ago, and not for this book. I did get invited to UCLA to talk about the book, though. So you're
Oh, well,
right.
that's good.
Southern
Now,
California has a bit of a different spirit. Look,
now let's
it
talk a little bit about arms. Joe Biden paused one shipment of arms. That's how they're spinning it now. But they've had a relay race of government officials going over there to basically put a drag line on Israel. They don't want Israel to fight this war. Have we ever seen this before?
Yeah. What we have here, I think, in some ways, is there, you know, the Biden administration is pretty upset with Israel over the Gaza war, but it has come to understand late, but it's come to understand it that the United States actually needs Israel and Saudi Arabia and the UAE if there's going to be any hope of avoiding a war with a rising Iran in the Middle East. And so, despite a lot of things, they keep getting pulled into supplying arms, but they're divided. they're wishy-washy. They don't want it to. They're afraid somehow that Israel would cause a big problem in the Middle East. They can't bring themselves to address the central problem in the Middle East, which is Iranian ambition and unchecked Iranian power.
When did the idea develop, Walter Russell Mead? And you are a student of this, perhaps our leading student of this, that Iran could be brought into the family of nations. We fell for this once with China, and I was on that boat. I stepped on that rake. I thought China would change, and China didn't change. It's still Leninist. There's a whole group of Democrats who believe Iran is going to change, that there are reformers therein. Are there? And when did that become part of the American foreign policy establishment's credo?
Look, I hope that democratic rule returns to Iran. I personally have never been to Iran. I would love to go. And when there's a democratic Iran, I'm going to go. But one thing I will probably not do is buy a rug from a rug merchant in Tehran, because the Iranians are very good at bargaining. And they've set up this kind of good cop, bad cop thing. Oh, I'm the moderate. You need to help us. We're fighting the hardliners. If you Americans would just give us some concessions, then you see, then that will allow us to win our inner power struggle with the hardliners. So help us help you. And Americans fall for this kind of thing over and over again. We've seen this. There's a real Iran lobby in the United States. People don't talk about it as much as they should, but there are people whose careers are invested in somehow this belief that if we just stop being so mean to Iran, those you know those mullahs would change, the government policy would change, and that's just not the way it works.
Yeah, my theory has always been everyone wants to be Nixon going to China. And for Obama, it was Obama going to Tehran. And it never happened, but it took root in the Democratic Party and it's still there. And as a result, we're blind to this. Let me make a transition, Walter, because it just turns out that Donald Trump's coming up next hour. And in the Ark of a Covenant, your book, you did a lot of ruminating on Donald Trump and the moment that he signifies in American history. You wrote on page 567 of the Ark of a Covenant, making Israel policy a linchpin of his approach to foreign affairs helped limit the impact of the radical hard right voices who hoped to hijack the Trump movement. I think Donald Trump was the most pro-Israel president since Truman. Do you agree with me on that?
I actually do, and I might even say he was more pro-Israel than Harry Truman. Because once Harry Truman actually had an arms boycott against Israel. And at the moment that the Israelis declared independence, Truman was still trying to get them to stop. Trump was a much more consistently pro Israel president. Again, I'd say not simply because of Israel, but because of a perception of the strategic realities in the Middle East.
Now, your assessment of Trumpism is really unique among public intellectuals. Another quote from a few pages earlier. Despite Trump's reputation for indiscipline and impulsiveness, to a remarkable degree, Trump consistently shaped his rhetoric and policies across the range of foreign and domestic policy to master the Republican Party. Trump used the Israel policy as he used trade policy, China policy, migration policy, and others to communicate with his base. Is he doing it again, Walter?
Yes, he is. Trump is a master of political messaging. Whether you're for Trump or against Trump, you've got to acknowledge that this man defeated first the establishment of the Republican Party, blew it out of the water, remade the party in his own image. Then he went on in 2016 to defeat the most powerful dynasty in American politics at the time, both the Bush side on the Republican process, and then the Clintons. So he is, I would argue that maybe no living human being, has dominated a higher percentage of the mind share of the whole human race than Donald Trump was. Everywhere you go around the world, you talk to foreigners, and all they want to talk about is Trump, 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 Trump. Love him or hate him, he is a phenomenon that I think a lot of sort of intellectuals haven't fully come to terms with, haven't thought through.
No, he called last night and said, "I'll do your show tomorrow if you can make time." I said, "We'll clear the decks." Of course, he's the best interview ever because people never know what he's going to say, but he always says whatever's on his mind, and that's what makes him a great interview. How do you think national security will play into this campaign, Walter Russell Mead?
I think it's going to be part for President Trump. It's going to be part of his attempt to say, look, Kamala Harris, the Democrats are not really a pro-American party. They want to take the America we've known and turn it into something much different, much worse. They hate America. They don't care about American national security. They want to help our enemies. This is going to be his kind of integrating theme, and also that they don't understand power, they don't understand reality, so that they will be trying to make concessions and appease powers that are unappeasable. All of this is part of the way that Trump presents himself to his base and to independent voters as somebody who you can rely on, whether you love him or hate him as a human being, to be a strong president for a country that's in a very dangerous world.
Now, Walter, this question may go into the break, and I'll let you cue you when we have to take a break so that stations can identify themselves. When last we met, it was over dinner to talk about China. And I thought China would dominate this campaign, but of course, 10/7 happened and the world changed. China is it taking advantage of this again? America just diverted a carrier group that was going to go to the South China Sea and it's going to the Gulf instead. Have we done it again? Taken our eyes off the prize?
In some ways, this has been going on since 2001, September 11th. The George W. Bush administration wanted to focus on China. The Middle East pulled us away. Barack Obama talked about the pivot to Asia. It didn't happen. So we need to focus on China, but the reality is we have a set of interests in other parts of the world that don't always let us, and we have to reconfigure our policies so we can do that.
The Ark of a Covenant is really a tour de force of American Israeli policy over the last 76 years and the next quarter century ahead. But I want to close, Walter, by asking you about what you think China is going to be doing between now and the new president. Uh, do you think they will actually attack Taiwan in the next 6 months?
I don't think in the next 6 months, but you cannot be sure. For the last 20 years, the United States has been really failing to respond to the greatest military buildup in the history of the world. That is China's military buildup. It is aimed at making it possible to forcibly occupy, to otherwise compel Taiwan to unify with China. If China succeeds in doing that, your world changes. Japan and South Korea will become dependent on China to be able to trade with the rest of the world. We'll see it. We'll see them moving away from an American alliance toward trying to accommodate China. We would see countries like India viewing the United States as no longer a viable pillar against China. We would see an enormous change in world politics, the global economy. China knows this. Now they're
So,
cautious.
Walter, a last question. I've always said presidential elections are always important. People always say it's the most important election in your lifetime. I do believe the direction of this country is going to shift radically depending on who wins. Would you agree with me that this is at least as stark as any electoral choice since 1980?
This is a landmark election. This will um, we will have one kind of country under a Trump presidency and another kind of presidency under a Harris presidency. At least that's the way it looks to me.
And how would that be a bad thing if it were the latter, if it were a Harris presidency? Is it something for which we are prepared or unprepared?
I think what we would see is a consolidation and maybe an irreversible consolidation of a kind of a union of sort of an establishment that has a vision. I think a kind of a Europeanist vision of the world, something that I think would put the U.S. on a path toward long term less prosperity, less freedom, less power and respect, and less security in the world.